Hi, I'm Brian Katulis. I'm senior fellow here at the Middle East Institute, and I'm host of the podcast Taking the Edge Off the Middle East. It's my pleasure to welcome all of you to our third webinar of the day on Israel's strike against Iran. We had one earlier this morning at 9:30 with our two colleagues, Colby Conley and Alex Vitanka, speaking about the energy and internal Iran dynamics with Ken Pollack. We had a second one with Barbara Leaf and myself and Ken Pollack as well, talking about regional security dynamics. And this is our third of the day. You'll find all of these on the website. Today, this afternoon, we're going to talk about the regional implications and fallout from several different angles. And we've got a great panel of experts to discuss the different dimensions of what we can expect from Israel's actions against Iran and the spillover effects in key countries and key parts of the region. And I'll introduce each of the speakers one by one, ask them a question, and then we'll have a little bit of interactive discussion. First, I want to turn to our colleague, Gregory Gause, who's a noted expert on Saudi Arabia and the Gulf, who's joined us as a senior scholar. Greg, thanks for joining us. One dimension that people have been talking a bit about on the edges, but I think is a terribly important one, is the role of countries like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, a country that a group of us were recently in during the fourth round of talks between the US and Iran. I guess the first question to you, Greg, is how do you see Saudi Arabia in particular, but then other countries like the UAE that have moved to improve their relations with Tehran in 2023 in March? What role, how are they reacting, but then how will they react in the medium to longer term about these events? Will they continue to seek to de-escalate tensions, or will they just simply stay out of things?
Well, Brian, I think that it's really different than what it would have been if these attacks had come during the first Trump administration, in which case the Saudis and the Emiratis, among the six Gulf Cooperation Council states, I think would have been enthusiastic supporters. But they've done a 180 on how to deal with Iran for all sorts of reasons we can get into. I think that they're worried for a couple of reasons. I think that they're worried that they will become the site of Iranian retaliation. And I don't think that that's an unreasonable fear. What we see is that the Iranian responses against Israel, while perhaps a bit more effective than they were back in October of 2024, are still not crushingly effective attacks on Israel from Iran. Whereas the targets on the Arab side of the Gulf, oil facilities, American bases, other infrastructure, are much closer to Iran and much easier to reach. So there's a fear on the Gulf states that they will be dragged into this as the targets. That's number one. Number two, the Saudis and the other Gulf states as well, but the Saudis in the lead here really took a 180 on how to deal with Iran, in part because they're so committed to this Vision 2030 economic development plan.
Yeah.
And they want to become a more significant hub for trade, for investment, for finance, for tourism, to lessen their dependence on oil as the oil era at some point will end. That's not going to happen if the Persian Gulf is a war zone. Capital is a coward. They're not. Foreigners are not going to invest in Saudi Arabia if they think that Saudi Arabia is going to be part of a regional war, and tourists are not going to come, and it's going to be difficult for all of the Gulf states to sustain this vision of themselves as entrepôts connecting East and West if there's a continual tension and violence and interstate conflict in the region. So I think that these are states that are worried about the spillover of these conflicts, but also very worried because they don't have much leverage on anybody here. Even the Saudis don't have much leverage on anybody here. And so I think that they're keeping their fingers crossed. And I think they're worried about the United States commitments here. They were told by President Trump on his visit to the region just a few weeks ago that President Trump was going to try to get a deal with Iran. And it appears that after what I think most people in diplomacy would consider a very brief time, although the president said that his deadline had been reached, that the United States gave the Israelis, if not the green light, a yellow light to launch this attack on Iran. And I don't think that the Gulf states will think that the United States played fair with them on that.
Yeah. Greg, if I could ask a follow-up question, and it relates to something we discussed in the 2 o'clock webinar, which you can find online. Barbara Leaf and I were discussing this gap between many of the Gulf states and Israel on Iran. How do you also see, and I think, again, we're obviously, for obvious reasons, focused on the Iran crisis right now and the war that's unfolding, but how do you see the positioning of Saudi Arabia and many of the Gulf states on the Israel-Palestine question versus where the current Israeli government is? Because simultaneous to this, and I think it's been postponed, there was a plan by Saudi Arabia with France to host a two-state solution conference at the UN. Right. My understanding is, as of today, that's been postponed. Do you see that gap on that file as well? And what does that mean for the broader potential for Gulf, and in particular Saudi-Israel relations in the medium to long term?
Right. Let's concentrate on Saudi here because they're the key. I think that since October 7th, the value to Saudi Arabia of normalization with Israel has gone down, and the cost for Saudi Arabia of normalization with Israel has gone up. The value has gone down because Iran is not nearly as threatening in Saudi eyes as it was during the Biden administration and the first Trump administration, when all the talk about Saudi-Israeli normalization was heating up. Iran was seen as a big threat to Saudi. But now, with the fall of the Assad regime, the decimation of Hezbollah, the near destruction of Hamas, Iran is and Iran's own military incapacity to deal with the Israelis back in the 2024 exchanges, Iran just doesn't look as threatening. Yeah. And because of the salience of the Gaza issue in Arab public opinion, the cost to Saudi Arabia, which does want to play a regional role, the cost to Saudi Arabia of formal normalization, diplomatic relations with Israel has gone up. So the value has gone down, the cost has gone up, and I think that's why the Saudis are more reluctant and are publicly saying that they won't move on normalization until that there's a clear timeline, a clear path toward Palestinian statehood. And their cooperation with France on that postponed or canceled conference is just another bit of evidence of that.
Great. Thanks, Greg. I'm going to turn to another key country, a leading country in the region, and ask a couple of questions to our colleague, Gonul Tol. Gonul, how has Turkey responded in the last 24 hours? I know we're still early in this crisis that started with Israel's attack on Iran. How has Turkey positioned itself? I saw the news that the foreign minister, Fidan, has been meeting with Jordanian and Iraqi officials. Is there some potential role for Turkey to play here in terms of a broader regional approach? But how do you see their initial reaction to what Israel has done here on against Iran?
Well, Turkish President Erdogan strongly condemned Israel's strikes, calling them a clear provocation and a blatant violation of international law. And then he went on to accuse Israel of pursuing a strategy that aimed at spreading instability across the region. So you can clearly see he's really worried about a region being drawn into chaos. And I think everything Greg has said about the Gulf can be applied to Turkey as well, except for the normalization bit. From Ankara's point of view, if the region edges toward a broader conflict, it would risk unraveling Erdogan's carefully crafted foreign policy. His recent strategy, particularly in the Middle East, has hinged on building friendly ties with regional countries to expand Turkey's economic, defense, energy, and infrastructure influence. And obviously, a regional war would not only derail that effort, but also deepen tensions with Iran. And that's something that really worries Ankara. The Kürecik radar station in eastern Turkey, it's a key NATO asset operated by the United States, and it has long angered Iran, which sees it as a threat, despite Ankara's insistence that data is shared only within NATO. But as we see, as conflict brews, the radar remains a main geopolitical flashpoint. And I should also mention that there's a domestic angle to this whole thing. The radar issue has always been politically very sensitive for Erdogan. Some of you might remember last year, after Iran's retaliation for Israel's strike on its consulate in Damascus, Turkey's director of communications went out of its way to deny that the US used data from the radar station to intercept Iranian missiles. And now, just today, the opposition, Turkish opposition, revived the debate and demanded the base be shut down. So domestically too, Erdogan is worried about the optics. And another worry is obviously its energy and trade ties. Now, compared to Trump's first term, first maximum pressure on Iran campaign, Erdogan has taken steps to make sure that Turkey is not as dependent on Iranian energy as it used to. But Iran still is a significant energy partner. And also, just last year, Erdogan and Iranian officials promised to deepen trade ties. So that is a constant worry. And obviously, with energy prices spiking, Turkey's already fragile economy faces yet another blow. So those are the concerns from Ankara's point of view.
Yeah. So Gonul, on the domestic politics, and you've written a lot about that. And your most recent book with Turkey and Syria was terrific. People should read it. I noted in the news that the head of the Nationalist Movement Party, the opposition leader, in addition to making an issue of the radar station, I think he said that Turkey is next on Israel's list. I don't know if that's right. How do you see the sort of the positioning, the public positioning of the different parties inside of Turkey? And we should acknowledge as well, this is a democratic system that's under siege, obviously, because of all of the moves that Erdogan has made against some of his competitors. But how are the different voices? Is there similarity to how they're viewing this? How are they trying to position themselves in terms of what Israel might do next and how this might play out for Turkey?
Well, anti-Israel sentiment is very strong in Turkey, and it cuts across party lines. And Erdogan, before Devlet Bahçeli, who is his nationalist ally, they're close allies, but Erdogan himself spoke about how Israel may target Turkey next. So that is, I think that just reminds us how much pressure President Erdogan is under domestically. So last year, Turkey held municipal elections, and Erdogan's ruling party received a huge blow, lost all major cities to the opposition. And one of the key reasons for that loss was the Islamist party, which is not Erdogan's party. The Islamist party actually managed to capture a lot of votes from Erdogan's ruling party, using this rhetoric that Erdogan is being soft on Israel. So Erdogan is very cognizant of that, and he's very self-conscious, and he came out right after the local elections saying that the reason we lost the elections is because we weren't able to convey where we stand on Israel-Palestine enough to our constituency. So that is something that he feels very self-conscious about. So that's why constantly he reminds the people that he's a strong supporter of the Palestinian cause. He's vocally very critical of Netanyahu, and yet there's still trade going on between the two countries. And just recently, the United Nations warned Turkey that there was a ship that docked in Turkey, and that was allegedly carrying materials to be sent to Israeli army. So you can see this split screen. On the one hand, Erdogan is under pressure, but still doing business with Israel, but he feels this need to portray Israel as a huge threat and his stance against Israel very strong.
Great. Thanks very much, Gonul. Great comments. I'm going to, before I turn to Charles, I want to pose a question to all of you, but I don't want you to answer it. I want you to think about it when we come to the conclusion. And it's this, is what do we think might be the strategic regional implications about the structure of the overall region, the different camps that exist? How might they position vis-a-vis this crisis as it unfolds? Will there be different sorts of alliances or partnerships? How does this impact sort of, if you think about the structure of the region 10 years ago, where there was this divide between, say, the Islamist camp of Turkey and Qatar versus Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE. Where are we right now? I don't want you to answer it right now, but think about the bigger dimensions. I know it's a bit of speculative analysis, but I think it would be an interesting thing to think about from your respective expertise, but then also from the bigger picture. Charles, obviously you've been working for years on Syria. You're a top expert on that country and on counterterrorism. We're lucky to have you at the Middle East Institute and on this webinar as well. I read your piece, which we put out a package today for those of you who've not seen it at the Middle East Institute of different perspectives by many of our scholars about the implications of this initial strike. Charles, what's your top line on how this new Syrian government, the de facto government and Ahmed Ashara and others are responding? And then how does this impact not just that government, but then the broader dynamics inside of Syria, which are still complicated?
Yeah, so thanks for the question. You spun me off by posing the question before, so I'll refocus my mind a bit.
It's a good one.
I mean, to be blunt, specifically to your question, the Syrian transitional government has done absolutely nothing. They've said nothing. They've done nothing. They've responded in no particular way. And that's not surprising. That is very much a continuation of the posture that they have presented at times over the last 6 months amidst regional geopolitical tensions, from one direction or the other, and particularly with regards to Israel. No secret, certainly no secret, that the transitional government harbors significant hostility towards Iran. So not particularly surprising that we haven't seen Damascus come out in the way that many other regional governments have to criticize the airstrikes. But at the same time, I think we all know that Syria's sort of transition is locked into a particularly tense moment with Israel. So equally, staying silent is a consistent pattern that we've seen, and very much an unsurprising development now. Looking at Syria, Syrians have been watching on, quite frankly, amidst the multiple sorties of Israeli aircraft flying across Syrian airspace ever since last night. Watching on as drones and missiles have been intercepted over southern Syria all day long. It was an interesting video filmed on the cell phone of a goat herder in southern Swade's desert this morning, of 2 Israeli Special Force C-130s coming back from Iran, presumably carrying some of the covert operatives that had been involved in launching the military action last night. But, interesting for an analyst, but very little in terms of substance, for all of the reasons that I spell out. And, to underline that point, the only real news we've seen from Syria's government today is a clarification of rules from the tourism ministry and the establishment of an election committee to elect the parliament. Those are the 2 big developments in Syria today. But more broadly to your question around how it affects Syria dynamics.
Yeah.
I mean, on the one hand, with regards to Israel, there has been for the last several weeks a very secret and highly sensitive channel of dialogue between the Syrian transitional government and Israel. Nobody is publicly acknowledging that, but it is real. The Syrian government have put their most astute so-called military diplomats onto that track. And the best that I've heard is that they've both in principle agreed to the idea that they should get to a kind of military detente, a kind of non-aggression pact. There's been a significant US push behind the scenes on that. Of course, Thomas Barak, as both the ambassador to Turkey and the special envoy to Syria, paid a visit to Israel to push forward that idea that a non-aggression pact was the first step that needed to be accomplished. I would say that the US readouts that I had from that trip were generally positive, but with the exception being that the final word at the table from the Israeli side was, but we still retain the right to act militarily in Syria wherever and whenever we deem necessary, which is, of course, still the fundamental issue on the table. But ultimately, Syria wants to get to that non-aggression pact, which is also why we've heard them say absolutely nothing and certainly intervene in no particular way. And then just very briefly on Iran, I think Syrians are cheering on the Israelis. And interestingly, in Syrian state TV today, a lot of the people interviewed around all of these developments have literally been cheering the Israelis on. Certainly nobody unhappy to see Iran under the knuckle and suffering, given everything that Iran and the IRGC have done in Syria over the past 14 years. And to be frank, Iran has been playing an under-the-table role in backing the anti-government insurgency in Syria over the past 4+ months, with some fairly sophisticated assistance. And so, again, seeing the IRGC suffer, seeing the head of the IRGC taken out and the Quds force taken out will be only a source for celebration and, frankly, relief for many within the transition, but also for a significant proportion of the population who see Iran still as a significant hostile threat and a challenge to their transitional process.
Yeah. So, Charles, maybe one follow-up to you, and it's specific to Syria, but refracted also through this broader lens of the crisis with Iran and the war, is how do you see 5 months into this Trump administration, the United States handling the transition in Syria? You mentioned a few things there in terms of what Tom Barak is doing, but what about the troop presence? Are they going to be under a threat here, a renewed threat in some sort of way? Where do you see all of that going? What's likely to happen under Trump, and then what do you think should happen ideally in terms of U.S. policy there?
That's a really big set of questions. I mean, I would say, traditionally, precedent has shown that when the Iranians are really under pressure, they have seen US military targets in the region as the soft target. Pressure on the US means pressure on Israel. I'm not sure we're going to see that this time. The main reason for that, to be very blunt about it, is that the Iranians have been smashed over the past 24 hours. I mean, they have been, we thought they had been humiliated during the April and October exchanges in 2024. But what we've seen the Israelis demonstrate and accomplish on Iranian soil through Iranian airspace over the past 24 hours, and what we've seen from Iran's response, which was far inferior compared to what we saw in 2024, would probably tend to tell me that the Iranians don't have much in the way of a possibility of retaliating beyond their relatively minimal response to Israel. And they wouldn't dare, I think, risk the wrath of dragging the Americans in by targeting US interests. That's my gut response, less than 24 hours in here. It is early days, but I think it is, when we looked back at what the Israelis did against Hezbollah, the complete intelligence penetration, the complete freedom of action, the decimation of senior military and intelligence leaderships, and now we can include nuclear scientists amongst that. What we've seen play out in this first round has been extraordinarily significant, and I think that actually limits Iran's ability to respond rather than forcing them to do more.
So last question. Do you think what Israel has done on certain operations in Syria were a test run for what we're seeing unfold in Iran?
In theory, and I've put this forward, I think, in public panels on this subject before with MEI. So in 2024, before Assad fell, several months before he fell, roughly 100 Israeli special forces helicoptered in the middle of the night and raided a deeply constructed under a mountain IRGC-controlled missile production facility in northern central Syria. They broke into the facility, they killed every single guard, every single soldier inside, allegedly took away several Iranians, along with lots of documentation, and then blew up the entire mountain on their way out. Smaller scale compared to some of the hardened mountain facilities in Iran, but back then I had absolutely no doubt this was a message. I mean, you know, the construction of rudimentary indigenous rocket and missile systems in Syria was small fry compared to what the Iranians have been up to in Iran. So yes, I think this was principally a demonstration of, look, this is what we're willing to do. We're capable of doing this. We know exactly where to go, how to get in, how to get out, and then destroy what we leave behind. So yes, far bigger undertaking to accomplish something like that against a nuclear facility in Iran. But when we take into consideration that apparently Israel had constructed a missile launch base on Iranian soil over the last 9 months, and had cells of Mossad operatives launching suicide drones all across the country last night, then presumably anything is possible. And so in that sense, I think that doubles down on my original theory, which was it was very much a demonstration of what they'd be willing to do. And I'll just conclude by saying I had heard from a very senior US military official about 6 months ago, when this discussion of strikes on Iran, you know, first developed, that the best we could do to fully take out the nuclear program, if the US put everything into that effort, would be to curtail it 3 months. And that was specifically if it was only an air and missile campaign. So the obvious question here is, well, the only way around that is to go in on the ground and physically to get inside these facilities. And again, that's the one thing that Israel demonstrated, albeit on a slightly smaller scale, on Syrian soil not that long ago.
So we'll be watching to see if that unfolds, if that scenario unfolds inside of Iran. Thanks, Charles. Last but not least, let's turn to Dunya, Egypt. Mirette Mabrouk. You and I actually had the pleasure of seeing some friends from Cairo just a few hours ago, and had a very vibrant exchange about these events. The initial sort of setup was to not talk about Iran so much, I think, but to talk about the wider issues. I guess to start out, the Iranian foreign minister was in Cairo earlier this month for talks that seemed to be part of a cautious rapprochement between Iran and Egypt. We discussed this a little bit in the session about how Iran renamed a street that had been named after Anwar Sadat's assassin. A lot of these asks that I think Egypt has had for decades from the regime. What do you think was going on there between Iran and Egypt, and what Iran was trying to do with Egypt in advance of this attack by Israel last night?
All right. So Egypt's situation is a lot different from the Gulf, a lot different from Turkey, from Syria. The involvement with Iran is on a massively superficial level, and it's not just because the Iranians gleefully named a street in Tehran after one of the guys who assassinated the late President Anwar Sadat. There have been a host of issues, but one of them is that there isn't that much overlap between Iran and Egypt. The rapprochement that you are referring to was significantly more one-sided. Iran has announced several times, Iran and Egypt are normalizing relations, and that hasn't happened. And the Egyptians have been extremely cautious about it. And I had one person explain it to me. He said, look, I mean, even if everything were hunky-dory, even if the sanctions were removed, even if everything was opened up again, Iran is not going to be a country that Egypt is going to just stroll in and do a lot of business with. It's an extremely closed economy. It's largely controlled by the Republican Guard. I mean, under the best of circumstances, relationships are going to be polite and extremely tentative. But it was kind of jarring that after decades of very tentative hello goodbye, the Egyptian foreign minister finally met with his Iranian counterpart Abbas Araghchi on June 10th, I think. And one of the things that they talked about, it was all, very, very placebo. One of the things they talked about was the importance of political tracks rather than military ones. And then, of course, this happened. Now, Egypt isn't involved in the same way. It doesn't have the same fears as the Gulf or certainly of Syria. It certainly doesn't have the same kind of emotional commitment or lack thereof of the Iranians, not at all. But Egypt does have 3 conflicts raging on its borders. It doesn't need any more of this. All right, it really doesn't. Not only that, it appears to have been caught up in a maelstrom of things that it's going to have to deal with, but are indirectly going to have an effect on it. The first one is Egypt is still bringing in its citizens and other pilgrims who made the Hajj pilgrimage, and they're coming in overland. That is now extremely problematic. It has had to, for a country that relies on tourism, it has had to scramble with tourists whose airspace has now been closed. They are rerouting airplanes, which is problematic. The Egyptian government, of course, came straight out and made pretty much the same declaration as the Turks did, which is we completely condemn this escalation. It is an unnecessary escalation. It could lead to a conflagration. It is in violation of international law, etc., etc. None of which, of course, will have any effect. What is likely to have effect is that Egypt is currently scrambling desperately on renewing or rather on safeguarding its energy supplies, because Egypt gets a lot of gas from Israel. So what they've done sort of immediately is halt natural gas supplies to various industrial activities. They're going to up the use of what is called mazot. It's fuel oil. And they're going to up those in power stations. Mazot is heavier and dirtier, so they've been trying to avoid it. But now, of course, it's all green lights, and they are going to centrally coordinate the operations of stations, because, of course, this happened just as we are entering the serious summer, and that's when electricity goes up. And Egypt has had problems with electricity over the past several years. It has just managed to sort it out. And a loss of electricity leads to a loss of public discontent, which affects.
Yeah. So one follow-up to you, Mirette, and in some of our previous webinars, though, we're talking about Iran and Israel for obvious reasons. The Gaza question came up, and how concerned do you think Cairo is about the impact of this attack by Israel against Iran on the efforts to get humanitarian aid into Gaza? All of the questions that are still unresolved and are still quite pressing and urgent for the millions of Palestinians who live in Gaza.
Okay, so it probably is not possible to overestimate the amount of concern that there is about Gaza, not just on the humanitarian level, but from a security point of view as well. But it's also aggravated by the fact that while all this is going on, Egypt is currently hosting completely accidentally, and they absolutely don't want to, what's being called the Samud convoy, which is about 2,000 activists that are descending on Egypt and come in through Libya, composed of mostly Algerian, Tunisian, and Mauritanian activists who are somehow marching towards Gaza to enter. It's very unclear. I think the only thing that was unclear is that somebody somewhere was hoping for some kind of confrontation. Rather unusually, the Egyptians didn't give it to them. Now, generally speaking, the Egyptians are very good at putting both feet in, but it hasn't happened this time. But all of this comes at a time when you are saying we support Gaza, but we are going to sit here quietly while Israel pounds another nation. So the optics are bad.
Yeah. So thanks for that. So we've got about 8-10 minutes left, and I threw out that question, and maybe to give a little bit more form to it so it's not so highfalutin. But what I'm trying to get at and get your assessment, and we'll go in the order where we basically started, and start with Greg and go in that direction, is when you think about, and we're in a period of high uncertainty and unpredictability of what may happen, and a lot depends on how Iran responds. But if you think about sort of the three key actors, two in the region and the US from the outside, Iran, Israel, and the United States, how would you say, in the case of Greg, how will Saudi Arabia try to relate to all of this as this crisis continues? Because it doesn't seem like it's going to end anytime soon. And how will that impact sort of the broader strategic dynamics across the region? What would be Saudi Arabia's positioning? They've condemned the strikes by Israel. They've had this attempt to de-escalate and rapprochement with Iran, but it still wants key strategic ties with the United States, which backs Israel. So, like, walk us through how you think, and it depends on the scenario, but how this might unfold for Saudi Arabia's position in the region.
I think that the Saudi-US relationship, which is the key one of those three relationships that Saudi would have with Iran, with Israel, the United States is the key one. And the Saudis feel that they have nailed down that relationship with President Trump. Mm-hmm. And they have done that the old-fashioned way with money, both with deals country to country, and also obviously with personal deals for President Trump's family. That's true of other Gulf countries as well. I don't think that they're particularly worried about the American relationship. I think what they're worried about is the reliability of the United States if Iran decides to retaliate against Saudi Arabia, against the Gulf. I don't know what the prospects of that are, but they're more than 0%. And the Iranians, I think, have an interest in demonstrating that attacks on them are not cost-free to the world. So I think that that's still potentially on the table. And the Saudis worry, given the precedent of 2019, when the first Trump administration did nothing when Iran hit Saudi oil facilities. The Saudis worry about American reliability. The broader question here, I think, if we look at let's think of this as the Gaza war from October 7th through these attacks. It includes the fall of the Assad regime. It includes the decimation of Hezbollah. It includes the Houthi violence against Israel. I think that what you just have to say is that in the future, it's going to be an Iran that is less influential and less powerful in the region.
Yeah.
And an Israel that feels that it has almost carte blanche militarily. But I also think that because of that, Israel is going to be seen not as a valuable potential ally, which pre-October 7th, right? I think that a lot of Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, saw Israel as a potential ally against Iran. I don't think that that's the case anymore. Israel's military power, up, but Israel's political ability to establish new relations with Arab countries and strengthen the ones they have, I think goes down.
Great. Gonul, same question to you. How do you think Turkey, especially under Erdogan, we talked a bit about the domestic politics, but under Erdogan, how will it seek to look at these three key relationships it has, and what role might that mean for its future in the region, Israel, Iran, and then the United States?
I think it will only reinforce a trend that we've been seeing from regional countries in the last few years that includes Turkey. And going back to what Greg has just said, I think the lesson that regional countries are drawing from what's going on in the region right now is you cannot trust the United States, right? So, and that conviction, and again, Greg referred to 2019 when Iranians attacked Saudi energy infrastructure. I think regional countries reached a conclusion at the time that, we cannot continue to pursue the post-Arab Spring military-focused foreign policy anymore. We cannot isolate Iran. So the best way forward is to engage Iran, develop regional diplomacy, and give up on the military option. And also reinforcing that trend was the fact that, Islamism posed less of a threat. That it was no longer hegemonic, it had lost ideological dominance and electoral primacy. If you remember, in the wake of the Arab uprisings, Erdogan's AKP was hailed as a model for the region, and he saw an opportunity to ride the Islamist wave to regional dominance. But both ambitions collapsed, right? The AKP model unraveled at home, and Ankara learned the hard way that an ideologically driven pro-Islamist foreign policy was very costly. So that's why he recalibrated his foreign policy for a very pragmatic approach. And we saw the same recalibration from the Gulf countries. So the understanding, the consensus between the Gulf countries and Turkey was that we're going to solve our own regional problems. You cannot trust the United States. Islamism is not that big of a threat. Erdogan dropped his Islamist agenda, so let's just do business. So moving forward, I think Turkey will certainly like the fact that Iran will be less powerful and Israel will be more isolated. And that will only reinforce the recalibrated foreign policy that Turkey has been following for the last few years.
Great. Charles, I know Syria is in the middle of a historic transition, and you described how it's reacted in the initial phases, at least the de facto government has, keeping its head down and things like this. How do you, and there was some talk of potential Abraham Accords and other things, which seemed to me to be a bit ahead of the curve. How do you think Syria will try to relate to these three countries, Israel, Iran, and then the United States backing Israel as this crisis unfolds?
Well, I mean, more or less a continuation of what we've already seen, if not more a doubling down on it. Again, for those few of us who've been following Syria and also, groups and movements that emanated out of northwestern Syria in the last, 8 months. It's been an open secret for a while that Ahmed al-Shara, his ultimate ambition was to seal what he was calling at the time a security deal with the United States.
Yeah,
that was back when he was only in Idlib. So he's more or less accomplished what he set out to achieve over the past 5 or 6 years, amidst all his various rebrandings and changes and purging extremists out of his movement by sealing the deal with Trump. So there really is no understating the sort of strategic significance in his mind of what he's accomplished over the last 3 or 4 weeks. The handshake with Donald Trump, the sanctions lifting, which has now rippled over, and we've got significant moves in the House and the Senate now to fully repeal the Caesar Act. So that's really moved forward incredibly quickly. As a result of that, there comes a kind of expectation that full engagement with the United States, and particularly with the Trump administration, will then lead to some form of a normalization with Israel. That's the sort of thorny challenge that's now on Ahmed al-Shara's desk, which is not an easy one to accomplish. Again, I understand that he is more than happy to see that sort of target set eventually realized. But Syrians have conditions on their table too. Israel newly occupied more than 200 square kilometers of territory in December last year after Assad's fall. There is absolutely no way there will be normalization with Israel in any form until that territory is handed back to Syria, as based on all the conversations I've had with the transitional government. And the Israelis have been very clear that they are not letting go of that territory. They see some of that territory, particularly around Mount Hermon, as existential in value. So that's still the challenge, which quite frankly is up to the United States to fix, not Syria and not Israel. That's the Trump administration's challenge. But last thing I'll say is the weaker that Iran becomes in Syria, around Syria, and further afield around the region, the more incentivized the rest of the region is to work on stabilizing the Syrian transition. I mean, we saw that already over the last 6 months, but my theory is that if things continue on the current trajectory in terms of Iran continuing to lose both credibility but also power through this Israeli campaign, that will be even more the case because as far as most of the region is concerned, Syria and its geographical location is the key to unlocking a much more integrated, much more interconnected, more prosperous and stable region. And so all the more so if Iran doesn't have a hand in trying to spoil that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Charles. And again, last but not least, Egypt, the most populous country in the region, still Dunya in my heart. Mirette, I know the Egyptians still want to maintain that strategic relationship with the United States. Things are tense with Israel. We talked a bit about how Iran was trying to reach out to them. How do you see Egypt positioning itself in the region as this crisis and war unfold?
So I think Egypt's actually got a problem with how it wants to position itself. Because I think Egypt has realized a long time ago that its position has shifted. It's not quite certain of where that position is yet, but more importantly, all the other players aren't quite certain. All right, they are certain that it is still important, it is still significant, but then the question is importance and significant how? Important as a power broker, important because of its population, important because of its geostrategic nature. All of these things have been weakened gradually, and they've been weakened. I mean, honestly, in almost directly proportional to the rise of the Gulf countries, which are not only richer, but they have become significantly more savvy. And I think for a long time, I think the Egyptians just dropped the ball. Having said that, Egypt has been busy recalibrating its relations for well over a decade now. I think Egypt was one of the countries that first realized that the world is no longer one big lump with the United States at the center. Egypt realized that quite early and started looking out to me, mostly started looking out to Africa, which it had ignored, but looking out to Africa, looking out to India. So it has been working on that. But I think what Egypt needs to do is recalibrate its relations with its Gulf neighbors. And honestly, I think it's going to have to pick a country that it can cozy up to. And it's going to have to pick the country where there are fewer reasons for friction than with some of the others. And for my money, that would be Saudi Arabia.
Yeah,
I could be wrong. But for my money, that would be Saudi Arabia.
Yeah.
But Israel, you have to remember that the relations with Israel on a military security level are actually pretty good. They are still pretty good, okay? And the Turkish friction has largely been taken off the table. So, it's easier now for Egypt to mobilize, but it does need to find its footing. I think it's been scrambling for a while, but it needs to find its footing. And Iran doesn't have anything to do with it, but its Gulf neighbors do.
Right, its Gulf neighbors do. Well, thanks, Mirette. And that'll have to be our last word for this webinar. And I want to thank you, Mirette, Charles, Gonul, Greg, for joining us on a Friday afternoon. I also want to thank our colleagues, Mahin Safian and Jasmine Terry, the whole team that actually makes this all happen. We can't do this without them, and there are many more that are unnamed to make us look so good and hopefully sound so good. And we appreciate those of you who've joined in online to watch this in the span of just less than 24 hours after Israel conducted the strike against Iran. We've had a lot of great work and thinking. These events aren't going away, nor is the Middle East Institute. We're going to be here as a resource for all of you, offering our expertise and trying to do our level best to offer clinical, balanced analysis. And the team we had here on this webinar, I think, did a terrific job. So I just want to thank all of you for joining, and please tune in to our continuing series of events and read our products as they come out. I'm Brian Katulis, signing off from this webinar.